Consulin from macrobusiness.com.au. He joins us every Saturday morning. It's the treasury of common sense. I'm delighted to say Mr. Van Onselen is on the line. How are you, Leith?
G'day, Luke. How's it going?
It's going very well indeed. A lot to unpack today. We had the budget and the reply during the week. We better start with the government's budget. What did you make of it?
If I had to give it a label, Luke, I'd call it a Band-Aid budget. So obviously, everyone who's listening here, you're probably sick to death of hearing about it because you've heard about it all week. But the signature policy measures were the cost of living relief in the form of rental subsidies, energy bill relief, and those sorts of things. Now, a lot of the conjecture around these has been whether or not the subsidies are going to drive inflation or not. My view is they won't, because they're obviously subsidies in the areas that are driving the inflation, so energy and rents. That said, they're not good policy. So effectively what the government's done is they're using your money to Band-Aid over its own policy failures. So, we all know about the rental market, right? So Australia's suffering a rental crisis like we've never had before. And that's been caused by the federal government's own reckless immigration policy. So, obviously we had nearly 550,000 net overseas migrants in the year to September. That's the latest data. All the the monthly data that's up until March shows that, those immigration levels are running near record levels, and that's given us a rental crisis. So the way the government's getting around that rental crisis or trying to, alleviate the pressures caused by it is going to spend billions of taxpayers' dollars to give rental subsidies out to lower income earners. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's not addressing the cause. Yep. It's addressing the symptoms which the government has created through its own policy failures. We can say the same with energy. I've said this to you last week, Luke, multiple other times. Australia's an energy superpower. Right? We are swimming in coal. We're swimming in gas. We have, energy coming out our ears, except in all areas except for oil. So we should have the cheapest energy prices in the world. I'm not talking about petrol here. I'm talking about obviously gas and electricity. Yeah. But through policy failure, we have super expensive energy on the East Coast, and that's driven up our cost of living. It's also sending our manufacturers broke. And instead of dealing with the problem at its source, the federal government is going to spend, again, our taxpayer money, giving us subsidies to try and alleviate the pressures caused by its own policy failures. So, that's my main issue with the budget. That's why I call it a Band-Aid budget. They're effectively going to spend our money to give us subsidies to alleviate the policy failures that it itself has created. So that's my sort of top level view of the budget.
What does it do to inflation? When I hear the Treasurer and others in government say, we're getting on top of things now, am I right, or have I lost the plot when I say, hang on, it's not you, it's people who've had their home loan repayments doubled due to those 12 or 13 interest rate rises that have had to pull their heads in otherwise with their spending, and people who try and pay their rent each week knowing that they're another week closer to another ridiculous increase. I mean, the inflation, if I can call it genie like everyone else seems to call it, being put back into the bottle is the work of Australians who've been really hammered, haven't they?
Yeah, so the Australian Bureau of Statistics released a quarterly survey called the Cost of Living Index. Yep. So what that basically does is it splits Australians into different cohorts, and the biggest cohort of that is obviously employee households. So that's Australians who work, which is about most of us. And the cost of living for Australians who work is running at nearly double the inflation rate. And the reason for that is because obviously we've got high rents, but more importantly, high mortgage costs. So mortgages have gone through the roof. That's not captured in the CPI inflation. And as a result, the CPI inflation is understated if you look at it in terms of cost of living sense. So yes, you're right. Australian households, especially working households, are getting absolutely smashed. The way I've sort of explained it previously, Luke, is we've got three Australias at the moment. So you've got, roughly 1/3 rents, roughly 1/3 has an owner-occupied mortgage, and roughly 1/3 owns their homes outright. Yeah. The first 2/3 are doing very badly. So obviously, if you're a renting household, you're getting smashed by super high rental increases. If you're a mortgage household, you're getting smashed by obviously high mortgage payments. And then you've got the other third who own their homes outright, and they're actually doing very well. They're racking up massive amounts of savings. They're investments are doing very well, so they're getting more bank interest, etc. And that group's actually spending at a rate that's higher than inflation, whereas the other 2/3 are spending at a rate that's lower than inflation. So unfortunately, the way the whole interest rate system's set up is it's designed to smash 1/3 of households, while obviously those who own the homes outright don't get impacted. And then you have the other third who rent, who aren't hurt by interest rates, but again smashed by this record immigration. So that's kind of the situation we're in.
So a mortgage repayment or mortgage repayment inflation, is that counted in other inflation numbers collected in economies around the world? Are we on our own in leaving that out?
No, well, I mean, it is sort of an international standard, although there are other economies like the US and Canada which do have a higher weight for housing. So ours is only about 6%, right? So housing inflation is 22%, so it's high. But rental inflation is only counted at about 6% of the CPI basket. There are other economies where it is a much higher weight.
Yeah.
So, for example, Canada and the US. So it is a little bit understated here. Look, from a cost of living indicator, the CPI inflation is not great. And that's why these living cost indexes, which get released about 2 weeks after the CPI come out, are a lot more relevant to your cost of living. And again, it shows that, employee households' cost of living's going up above 6% a year in the most recent figures, which is nearly double the inflation rate.
Yeah. So just before we get to Dutton, and I think it might be $19 a fortnight for single people. I could be wrong, but that's a number that sticks in my head from the coverage of the budget through the week. If there are people that only had their rent go up $19 a fortnight, then you beauty. But these rental subsidies don't come to much, surely. And it's a government's cause, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's also it's for lower income renters as well. So if you don't meet the means test, you don't get it. Look, again, this is why I call it a band-aid. Like, it's going to alleviate some of the rental inflation, but it's not going to alleviate most of it. And again, it's this rental inflation. Let's be honest, it's been caused by the government's mass immigration policy. That is the truth. They let in way too many people once we opened the borders. Australia, they told us they weren't going to do that before last election. Albo said multiple times he's not going to reboot the Big Australia policy. And then obviously they've created the problem. And Australians didn't want this. And the government said they weren't going to do it. So the federal government's immigration policy is what's driven this rental crisis. Just simply too many people chasing too few properties at the same time as the whole construction industry is, it's on its knees. They can't build enough homes because of higher costs and all the other things we always talk about. So, again, it's a band-aid budget.
Now, Peter Dutton must listen to our segment here. Did he go far enough in his response?
Yeah, look, to be honest with you, my initial response was I thought he didn't go far enough. But then look, I've got to be a realist. I'm never going to get what I want on immigration. Right? So if I had my way, I'd simply bring immigration back to its pre-2005 level. And the reason why I say pre-2005, that's when the whole Big Australia thing started. So the federal government basically opened, started under the latter years of Howard. They opened the floodgates. Australia's net overseas migration averaged 90,000 a year in the 60 years post-World War II. And then the 15 years leading up to the pandemic, it ramped up to 220,000 a year on average. Yep. And obviously the last year we've seen a blowout to 550. But, to Dutton's credit, he has promised some fairly decent cuts. So Dutton in his budget reply speech said that if he was elected, he's going to reduce the number of permanent visas from 185,000 planned this financial year to 140,000 the next 2 years, 150 in year 3, 160 in year 4. I'm not sure why he's going back up. He should, at least keep it at 140 permanently. And just to put that into perspective, if he does bring it back to 140,000, that'll basically bring us back to what it was in 2006 levels, the permanence. Now, my biggest concern is he hasn't said that much about curbing temporary visas other than that we've got too many international students and the numbers should be capped. So, in 2019, which was the last year before the pandemic, the Morrison government ran a permanent migrant intake of 160,000. Yet we had net overseas migration of 250,000. So really we need sort of cuts on both the permanence and the temporary side. And I think under Dutton's policy, we're still going to see very high immigration flows from a historical perspective, but obviously a lot better than what we've seen in the last year or so. So it's definitely an improvement. I should give him credit for that. I was a bit harsh on him when I first saw it. So, my skepticism around politicians is always there. I just can't help it. I'm sorry. And there was some other stuff. Like Dutton also said he's going to ban temporary migrants from buying Australian homes for 2 years. Again, I don't know why he's just said for 2 years, because the fact of the matter is before the GFC, temporary migrants couldn't buy established homes. The Rudd-Gillard government changed those rules and allowed temporary migrants to buy homes, which is stupid. So basically he wants to roll that back, but he says he's only going to do it for 2 years. Well, why not make that permanent? So it is definitely an improvement. And I think also the migration thing, you should bring it down to, if he's going to do 140, keep it at 140. Don't then say we're going to go back up to 160, which is what it was the last year of the Morrison government before the pandemic.
Yeah.
When we had 250,000 net overseas migration.
Yeah. Tell me about the unemployment rate. We saw it tick up through the week, 4.1% in April. Underemployment rate also up by 0.1% to 6.6. Now, this is a bit higher than what Treasury had forecast, the same Treasury that's forecast that inflation will be at its lowest later in the year. What did you make of that number, and what impact does that have on, what happens with interest rate cuts into the future?
Yeah, so Australia's unemployment rate's edged up. It actually, so it went to 4.1. Economists were tipping 3.9%. So it's worse than that. Also, the unemployment rate's now very close to the RBA's end of year unemployment forecast of 4.3%. Now, it's important to note that the rise in unemployment hasn't been driven by employers slashing jobs, all those sorts of things, and people being made redundant. It's been driven by the fact that we've got this record migration. And what it's basically doing is it's adding workers to the economy quicker than we can create new jobs. So, Australia's civilian population grew by 2.9% in the year to April, according to the ABS, which is an enormous increase.
Yeah. And
Australia needs to create 40,000 jobs a month just to keep the unemployment rate stable with this such strong population growth. So, look, it's kind of a double-edged sword. So it's obviously not good having rise in unemployment, because it means that if you're new to Australia or a young person who's left, finished uni or whatever, you're trying to get a job, it's going to be harder. But the silver lining is that it's another wet blanket over this whole notion that we're going to get interest rate rises. And it comes on the back of data released the previous week by SEEK, which showed that the number of applicants per job ad is tracking 55% higher than 2019 levels. So again, this is a story of too many people, like too many new workers coming into the economy, mostly through migration, and not enough jobs. And also this week, we also received a couple other poor data points, Luke. The most important one of that was we got the March quarter wage growth, and wages only grew by 0.8% over the March quarter versus CPI growth of 1%. So what that means is that real wages are against falling once more, and they're actually running 7.1% below their June 2020 peak, and they're tracking at 2010 levels. So what that tells you is we've effectively lost 14 years of progress in living standards if you look at it in terms of real wages. Then here's the kicker. The budget forecast that Australian real wages are only going to recover to December 2014 levels by mid-2028. And by mid-2028, real wages are still going to be 4.3% below their mid-2020 peak. So even the federal budget projects that Australians are going to have lost about 14 years of progress in living standards by 2028. So, it's a pretty diabolical, picture there.
Yeah.
And it comes on the back of, obviously, the collapse in retail sales and all these other indicators. So the bottom line is, I can't see the RBA raising interest rates under these conditions when you've got rising unemployment, a weakening economy, deepening per capita recession, and all these other things. So I think the whole notion of rate hikes has been thrown out the door, and I still think the next move in interest rates is going to be down.
Okay. Leith Van Onselen, macrobusiness.com.au, and we thank you for your time, mate. Have a great weekend. I'll talk to you next week.
Cheers, Luke.
Thank you, sir. Leith